There is a war being fought inside you right now, not with weapons of steel or fire, but with whispers and shadows, with memories and desires, with the voice that says, I am, and the silence that asks, but who am I really? This war has no generals, no treaties, no ceasefire. It began the moment you became conscious of yourself as separate from the world. It intensifies every time you make a choice, every time you suppress a feeling, every time you present one face to the world, while another face watches from behind your eyes. The ancient Greeks called it the conflict between Apollo and Dionysus, order versus chaos, reason versus passion. The medieval mystics spoke of the battle between the carnal self and the divine spirit. Freud mapped it as the eternal struggle between id, ego, and superego. Jung saw it as the confrontation between the ego and the self, between the persona we wear and the wholeness we've forgotten. But tonight, we descend deeper than terminology. Tonight, we enter the actual terrain of this war, not as observers, but as participants. Because you are not watching this conflict from a distance. You are the battlefield itself. Imagine for a moment that consciousness is like an ancient city built upon layers of forgotten civilizations. The streets you walk, your daily thoughts, your conversations, your routines, these are the surface. But beneath them lie catacombs. Beneath the catacombs, ruins. Beneath the ruins, something older still, something that remembers when you were whole, before language divided experience into words, before mirrors taught you to see yourself as an object. The ego is the city's mayor, convinced it built everything, convinced it's in control. The soul is the underground river that was there before the first stone was laid, that will be there after the last wall crumbles. And between them, war. Always war. But here is what most people never understand. This war is not meant to be won. It is meant to be transformed. Carl Jung spent decades exploring what he called the individuation process, the journey towards psychological wholeness. He discovered that the conflicts we experience internally are not signs of dysfunction, but invitations. Invitations to descend, to confront, to integrate. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness. Let us not flinch from that word. The darkness is not evil. It is simply everything the ego has deemed unacceptable, everything the soul has been forced to hide. Your rage, your grief, your forbidden desires, your secret self that watches through your eyes and wonders why you pretend so much. In Jungian psychology, the ego is the center of consciousness, the I that thinks and decides and remembers. It is necessary, vital, the organizing principle that allows you to function in the world. But it is not the totality of who you are. It is a fragment that believes itself to be the whole. The soul, or what Jung called the self with a capital S, is the totality. It includes the ego but transcends it. It encompasses the unconscious, the shadow, the forgotten parts, the unlived lives, the potentials you never explored, the person you might have been if society hadn't carved you into an acceptable shape. And here is the tragedy. From the moment we're born, we're taught to wage war against ourselves. Your parents told you, "Don't be angry," so you buried your anger in the catacombs. Your teachers told you, "Don't be so sensitive," so you built walls around your heart. Society told you, "Be successful, be attractive, be normal," so you created a mask, what Jung called the persona, and you wore it so long you forgot it wasn't your face. Layer by layer, brick by brick, you constructed a self that could survive in the world. And in doing so, you went to war with the self that simply wanted to be. This is the inner war. This is the descent into shadow. This is the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell mapped, but relocated from the external world to the internal one. You are Odysseus, lost in the labyrinth of your own psyche. You are Dante, descending through circles of your own making. You are every protagonist who has ever looked into the abyss and realized the abyss was looking back with their own eyes. But why does this matter? Why spend over 2 hours exploring this internal conflict? Because this war determines everything. It shapes your relationships. You cannot love another fully when you're at war with yourself. It influences your choices. Every decision becomes a negotiation between what you want and what you think you should want. It affects your health. The body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk discovered, storing every unprocessed trauma, every suppressed emotion, every lie you've told yourself. More than that, this internal war shapes civilization itself. Jung believed that collective unconsciousness influences culture, that the shadows we refuse to confront individually rise up as collective madness, war, fascism, mob violence, the projection of our denied selves onto others. The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate, he wrote. In other words, the war within becomes the war without. So tonight, we make the descent. We trace this conflict from its origins in childhood to its manifestations in adulthood. We explore the mechanisms by which the ego defends its kingdom and the soul wages its subtle rebellion. We examine the casualties of this war: creativity, authenticity, joy, and the moments when peace becomes possible. We will walk through the territory mapped by depth psychology, existential philosophy, neuroscience, and ancient wisdom. We will meet the archetypes that populate this inner landscape: the shadow, the anima and animus, the wise old man, the symbols that speak when words fail. And if you allow yourself to truly listen, truly descend with me into these depths, you may discover something extraordinary: that the war between ego and soul is not a curse but a chrysalis, that the conflict itself is the process by which consciousness evolves, that what you've called your breakdown might actually be your breakthrough. The ancient alchemists had a motto: solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, break down and rebuild, die and be reborn. This is the promise of the descent into shadow, that by confronting the war within, by making the darkness conscious, by integrating what we've denied, we become whole. Not perfect. Perfection is the ego's fantasy, but whole, complete, authentic. We become, in Jung's words, individuated. We become who we always were beneath the masks and armor. We stop fighting ourselves and start living from the center. Are you ready? Are you willing to descend into the battlefield of your own becoming? Then let us begin. Let us trace this war to its origins. Let us understand how the child, born whole, splits into ego and shadow. Let us witness the birth of internal conflict and, perhaps, discover the path to its transcendence. The journey awaits. The catacombs are opening. And somewhere in the darkness, your true self is waiting to be remembered. In the beginning, there is no war. There is only wholeness. Picture a newborn infant, fresh from the womb. She does not yet know she is separate from the world. When she feels hunger, the universe hungers. When she feels comfort, existence itself is comfort. She is pure being, undivided, uncensored. She cries when she needs to cry, reaches when she desires to reach, expresses rage and joy with equal authenticity. This is what psychologists call the primary narcissism phase, not narcissism in the negative sense, but a state of merged consciousness where self and world are one. The infant is, in a sense, whole, not yet conscious of wholeness but embodying it. Then comes the fall from grace, the division, the war's first declaration. It happens gradually, inevitably, necessarily. The child begins to learn that she is separate. The mirror shows her a face. Language gives her the word I. And with that word comes a border, a fortress wall around something called me, that is different from not me. This is the birth of the ego, and it is beautiful. It is necessary. Without it, we would remain merged with the world, unable to function, unable to survive. The ego is consciousness arising within the unconscious, like an island forming in the sea. But here's where the war begins. The child quickly learns that not all of her is acceptable. When she expresses rage, mother withdraws love. When she explores her body, father says shame. When she wants to play, society says work. When she feels deeply, the world says control yourself. Psychologist Donald Winnicott called this the development of the false self, a compliant persona created to maintain connection with caregivers. The child learns to present an acceptable version of herself while burying the unacceptable parts. She learns to perform. And where do the unacceptable parts go? Into the shadow. Jung described the shadow as everything about ourselves that we cannot accept, everything we repress because it threatens the ego's image of itself. The shadow is not evil, it is simply unintegrated. It contains our rage, yes, but also our spontaneity, our selfishness, yes, but also our authentic power, our darkness, yes, but also the creative wildness we sacrifice to become civilized. Let me tell you a story. In ancient Greece, there was a concept called dismemberment, the ritual tearing apart of something whole to reveal its essence. The god Dionysus, in myth, was torn apart by the Titans, his pieces scattered across the earth, only to be reassembled and reborn. This is what happens to us. We are the dismembered god. Each time we hear, "Don't be that way," a piece of us is torn off and hidden. Each time we hear, "Be like this instead," we sculpt ourselves into a shape that fits the mold. By the time we reach adulthood, we've forgotten we were ever whole. We've identified completely with the persona, the acceptable face. The ego sits on its throne, convinced it is the kingdom, unaware that beneath it, in the dungeons, in the catacombs, in the sealed chambers of the unconscious, the rest of ourselves still lives, still breathes, still screams for recognition. Freud saw this split differently, but arrived at similar conclusions. He mapped the psyche as id, ego, and superego, the instinctual drives, the conscious self, and the internalized voice of authority. The id says, "I want." The superego says, "You shouldn't." The ego, caught between them, says, "I must find a way to satisfy both." But it cannot. The compromise is always incomplete. The ID doesn't disappear when denied, it goes underground. It becomes the slip of the tongue, the forgotten appointment, the dream that wakes you at 3 a.m. with your heart racing. Freud wrote, "The unconscious is the true psychical reality. In its innermost nature, it is as much unknown to us as the reality of the external world. Unknown. That's the key word. We go to war with parts of ourselves we don't even know we have. Consider this from a neuroscientific perspective. Modern brain research has revealed that consciousness is not a unified field, but a collection of processes competing for dominance. The left hemisphere tends toward narrative coherence, creating stories about why we do what we do. The right hemisphere processes emotion, intuition, the non-verbal dimensions of experience. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga discovered through split brain research that when the left hemisphere doesn't understand why the right hemisphere acted, it invents a reason. It confabulates. It creates a story to maintain the ego's illusion of control and consistency. In other words, the ego is a storyteller, and much of what it tells us about ourselves is fiction designed to maintain coherence. Meanwhile, the right hemisphere, the limbic system, the body itself, they hold truths the ego cannot speak. Traumas encoded in muscle memory, emotions too large for words, intuitions that bypass logic. The soul speaks in symbols, in somatic sensations, in symptoms. This is the war at the neurological level. Different systems competing for expression, with the ego acting as gatekeeper, censoring anything that threatens its narrative. But let us return to origins. Let us trace this split through the stages of development. Erik Erikson mapped 8 stages of psychosocial development, each with its crisis. In infancy, trust versus mistrust. In early childhood, autonomy versus shame. In preschool, initiative versus guilt. At each stage, the child must navigate between authentic self-expression and social acceptability. Most of us fail to find balance. We learn shame for our autonomy. We learn guilt for our initiative. We internalize the critical voice until it becomes our own. Until we no longer need external punishment. We punish ourselves. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the act of lying to oneself, of pretending we are only what our roles dictate, of denying our freedom to be otherwise. He argued that we flee from the anxiety of authentic existence into predetermined identities, the waiter who is only a waiter, the teacher who is only a teacher, the person who has forgotten they chose this mask and could choose differently. This is existential inauthenticity, the ultimate form of the war between ego and soul. We go to war with our own freedom, our own possibility, our own becoming. Here's a thought experiment. Close your eyes, not literally, since you're listening, but mentally. Imagine you could press a button that would show you a complete and honest inventory of everything you've repressed, every feeling you've denied, every desire you've suppressed, every aspect of yourself you've hidden away. Would you press it? Or does something in you recoil? That recoil, that's the ego's defense mechanism activating, because the ego knows at some level that full awareness would shatter its carefully constructed identity. The ego survives by not knowing, by maintaining what psychoanalysts call splitting, the division of experience into acceptable and unacceptable, good and bad, me and not me. But the soul, the self, contains all of it. The soul is the totality that the ego fears, and so the war continues. The ego fortifies its position. It develops elaborate defenses, repression, projection, rationalization, sublimation. Freud catalogued dozens of defense mechanisms, all of them designed to protect the ego from truths it cannot integrate. Repression, pushing threatening thoughts into the unconscious. Projection, attributing our own unacceptable qualities to others. I don't hate. They hate me. Rationalization, creating logical reasons for choices driven by emotion. Sublimation, channeling unacceptable impulses into socially acceptable activities. Each defense is a battle tactic in the inner war. Each one costs energy, attention, aliveness. Each one distances us further from wholeness. But here's what Jung understood that Freud missed. The goal is not to eliminate the unconscious, not to make everything conscious, not to win the war by crushing the shadow. The goal is integration. The goal is to make the ego and shadow allies rather than enemies. The goal is individuation, becoming undivided. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But who are you truly, before the division, before the war, before the masks and armor? This is the question that haunts every human life. This is the question that drives the descent into shadow. This is the question that makes the inner war not a tragedy, but a transformative journey. Because hidden in the conflict is the answer. Hidden in the descent is the treasure. Hidden in the darkness is the very light we've been seeking externally. The ancient mystery religions knew this. The initiates at Eleusis descended into darkness and emerged transformed, having died and been reborn. The shamanic journey follows the same pattern: descent, dismemberment, reassembly, return. The hero's journey Campbell mapped is the same story told externally that we're living internally. We must descend. We must meet what we've denied. We must face the shadow we've been fleeing. Only then does the war become something else. Only then does conflict become conversation. Only then does the divided self remember its original wholeness. But that is ahead of us still. First, we must understand the war in its fullness. We must see the casualties, the mechanisms, the madness of it. We must descend further into the battlefield, because the origins are only the beginning. The real conflict, the true descent, happens when the unintegrated shadow rises up and demands recognition, when the soul fights back, when the war becomes impossible to ignore. That is where we turn now, to the crisis, to the conflict, to the moment when the carefully constructed ego meets the force it can no longer contain. Are you still with me? Are you feeling the edges of your own shadow as we speak? Are you noticing the discomfort, the resistance, the voice that says, "This doesn't apply to me"? Good. That's the ego recognizing danger. That's the first crack in the fortress wall. Let's make it wider. The shadow does not stay buried. It cannot. You can fortify the ego's kingdom with 1,000 defenses, but the shadow is patient. It waits. It gathers strength in the darkness. And when the conditions are right, when stress increases, when defenses weaken, when life breaks the careful patterns we've built, it rises. This is the midlife crisis. This is the dark night of the soul. This is the moment when the person you've pretended to be can no longer contain the person you actually are. Jung called it enantiodromia, the tendency for things to turn into their opposite when they reach their extreme. The person who has been good all their life suddenly acts out. The rational person descends into irrationality. The controlled person explodes. This is not random. This is the shadow demanding its due. Let me paint the picture more vividly. Imagine a successful professional. Let's call him David. Mid-40s, corporate executive, marriage, children, mortgage, reputation. He's built his life on discipline, control, rationality. He presents to the world as competent, confident, composed. His ego identity is solid. I am a responsible, successful man. But beneath that identity, in the catacombs of his psyche, lives everything David has denied to maintain that image. His creativity, suppressed for practicality. His vulnerability, armored against from childhood. His rage at his father, never expressed. His desire for freedom, sacrificed for security. His wild artistic soul, locked away when he chose business school over art school at age 22. For years the shadow sends signals, dreams of falling, of being chased, of forgetting something important, vague dissatisfaction, a sense that something is missing, minor symptoms, insomnia, tension headaches, emotional numbness, the soul trying to get attention. David ignores these signals. He has responsibilities. He doesn't have time for existential angst. He doubles down on what's worked. More work, more control, more performance. Then one morning he wakes up and cannot get out of bed. Not physically. There's nothing medically wrong. But psychologically, something has broken. The persona cracks. The ego's defenses fail. And David finds himself weeping for reasons he cannot articulate, feeling a despair that has no logical source, confronting a void that his achievements cannot fill. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the shadow rising. This is the soul saying, "You cannot ignore me anymore." In Jungian terms, David is experiencing what happens when the persona, the social mask, becomes too rigid, too disconnected from the self. The ego has identified so completely with its role that it has lost contact with the deeper psyche, and the psyche revolts. Jung observed that these crises typically occur at life transitions, adolescence, midlife, old age, times when the ego's previous adaptations no longer serve, times when life itself demands transformation, but transformation requires death, the death of who we thought we were, the death of the ego's cherished identity. And the ego does not go gently. This is where the war intensifies. This is where the conflict becomes conscious. The ego has essentially 3 options when the shadow rises. Option 1, suppression. Push it down harder. Increase the defenses. Medicate the symptoms. Distract with addiction, work, consumption, entertainment. I don't have a problem. Everything is fine. I just need to try harder. This is the path of continued warfare, and it leads to escalation, because what we resist persists, what we deny grows stronger in darkness. The shadow doesn't disappear, it metastasizes. Option 2, projection. Recognize that something is wrong, but locate the problem outside yourself. It's my spouse's fault. It's my boss's fault. It's society's fault. It's the world that's broken, not me. This is psychological displacement. The internal conflict becomes external. We go to war with others rather than with ourselves. We become righteous, victimized, convinced of our innocence and others' guilt. But projection doesn't resolve the inner war. It only creates outer ones. We attract exactly what we deny in ourselves. The rage we project onto others comes back as their rage toward us. The judgment we cast returns as judgment. The shadow we see in others is always, always a reflection of our own. Option 3, integration. This is the path Jung advocated, but it's the hardest. It requires the ego to do something unnatural, surrender its supremacy, to acknowledge that it is not the totality, to open the gates of the fortress and invite the enemy in, not to be destroyed, but to be transformed through relationship. Let me share what this looks like in practice, because integration is not an abstract concept, it's a lived process. Integration begins with awareness, not judgment, awareness. Noticing the shadow's presence, in dreams, where it appears as the figure you fear or hate, in projections, where you feel disproportionate emotion towards someone who's merely reflecting your denied traits, in symptoms, where the body speaks what the mind won't acknowledge, in slips, mistakes, accidents, what Freud called parapraxis, where the unconscious leaks through. The next step is acknowledgement. This is harder. The ego must admit, this is also me. This rage, this fear, this desire, this weakness, this is mine. Not all of me, but part of me. A disowned part that has been speaking in code. Then comes dialogue. This is where depth psychology becomes practical. You can literally speak with your shadow. Active imagination, Jung called it. You enter a meditative state and allow the disowned part to have a voice. You ask it questions. What do you want? What do you need? Why are you here? And if you listen, truly listen, the shadow reveals itself not as enemy but as messenger. It carries the very qualities the ego needs for wholeness. The rejected rage contains your power. The denied sadness contains your depth. The forbidden desires contain your aliveness. Shadow work is not about indulging every impulse. It's not about acting out destructively. It's about bringing what was unconscious into consciousness so it can be understood, integrated, and channeled constructively. Let's return to David. Imagine he chooses the path of integration. He begins therapy, not to fix himself or return to normal, but to understand what's happening. His therapist, trained in depth psychology, helps him explore his dreams. In them, he's pursued by a dark figure. But instead of running, the therapist suggests, what if he turned and faced it? David resists. The ego doesn't want to face the shadow. But eventually, in a session, he closes his eyes and imagines turning to confront his pursuer. What do you want from me? He asks the darkness. And the shadow speaks, not in words but in feelings, images, memories. It shows him the boy he was at 7, drawing pictures for hours, lost in creative flow. It shows him the young man who wrote poetry, who felt deeply, who dreamed of making art that mattered. It shows him the moment he chose security over authenticity, the moment he internalized his father's voice saying, art doesn't pay the bills. The shadow is not his enemy. The shadow is the artist he abandoned to become successful, the sensitive soul he armored to become strong, the authentic self he sacrificed to become acceptable. Tears come, not weak tears, liberating tears, because David is remembering, he's recognizing, he's reclaiming. This doesn't mean he quits his job and runs away to paint. Integration is not about dramatic rupture. It's about bringing the shadow into relationship with conscious life. David begins painting again, not professionally, but for himself. He allows himself to feel more, to be vulnerable with his wife, to tell his children about the parts of himself he's kept hidden. The depression lifts, not because the shadow disappeared, but because it was given a place. The inner war didn't end with victory. It ended with armistice. The ego and shadow became allies. This is what healing looks like. Not the elimination of conflict, but its transformation. But not everyone chooses integration. And this is where the war becomes tragic. When the ego refuses to integrate the shadow, when it continues warfare against the disowned self, the shadow finds other ways to express itself, often destructive ways. Addiction is one route. The shadow takes over in moments of unconsciousness, seeking the aliveness, the relief, the transcendence the ego denies. The person becomes split, sober self and using self, day self and night self, conscious self and shadow self. Affairs are another route. The shadow finds in another person what it cannot find at home, not because the spouse is inadequate, but because the spouse represents the ego's choice, the acceptable life. The affair partner represents the shadow's hunger, the unlived life, the forbidden self. Violence is another route. Rage, long suppressed, erupts. Road rage, domestic violence, mass shootings. When you study the biographies of people who commit sudden, inexplicable acts of violence, you often find the same pattern: over-controlled ego, suppressed shadow, then explosion. Jung warned about this at the collective level. He watched Germany in the 1930s descend into madness and recognized the dynamic: a culture that had suppressed its shadow, its chaos, its ancient gods, until the shadow rose up as fascism. The denied darkness didn't disappear. It possessed an entire nation. When an inner situation is not made conscious, Jung wrote, it happens outside as fate. Your personal shadow, unintegrated, becomes your fate. The collective shadow, unintegrated, becomes history's atrocities. Let's examine the mechanisms more closely. How does the shadow operate? How does it wage its war? First, through dreams. Freud called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. They are the shadow's primary communication channel. In dreams, the ego's defenses lower, and the unconscious speaks in symbols. The house with rooms you never knew existed? That's the psyche revealing its unexplored spaces. The tidal wave approaching? That's emotional content you've been holding back. The dark figure pursuing you? That's the shadow, trying to catch your attention. Most people ignore dreams or dismiss them as random neural firing. But Jung spent decades showing that dreams have structure, pattern, meaning. They compensate for conscious attitudes. If you're too rational in waking life, dreams bring emotion. If you're too controlled, dreams bring chaos. The dream is the shadow's letter to the ego. Usually the ego throws it away unread. Second, through projection. This is perhaps the shadow's most insidious mechanism. We see in others what we cannot see in ourselves. The qualities you most dislike in others, those are your shadow qualities. The person who infuriates you, they're holding a mirror to your disowned self. The traits you judge most harshly, those are the traits you've most harshly judged in yourself. This is not to say that other people don't have flaws. They do. But the emotional charge you feel, the disproportionate reaction that comes from projection, that comes from encountering your own shadow in external form. There's a simple test. If someone irritates you but doesn't trigger deep emotion, that's probably just personality difference. But if someone enrages you, if you feel compelled to criticize them, if you can't stop thinking about their flaws, that's projection, that's your shadow. Third, through symptoms. The body remembers what the mind forgets. Trauma gets encoded somatically. Emotions get stored as tension. The shadow speaks through psychosomatic illness. Bessel van der Kolk's research showed this definitively. The body keeps the score. Unprocessed trauma doesn't disappear. It manifests as chronic pain, autoimmune disorders, digestive issues, heart problems. The shadow literally makes us sick. And fourth, through synchronicity. Jung noticed that when psychic content reaches critical mass, external events mirror internal states, not through causation, but through meaningful coincidence. You think of someone and they call. You dream of a symbol and encounter it the next day. The external world seems to reflect the internal war. This is not mysticism, it's pattern recognition. When the psyche is activated, we notice what matches our inner state. But the effect is eerie, uncanny. It feels like the universe is speaking, like fate is intervening. These are the shadow's weapons. These are how the war manifests. And the ego, if it's wise, learns to read these signs, to stop fighting and start listening. But wisdom is rare. Most of us remain at war with ourselves for decades, some for entire lifetimes. Consider the person who maintains a perfect facade while drowning internally. The person who smiles while their soul screams. The person who achieves every external marker of success while feeling empty. This is the war's chronic state, not explosive crisis, but quiet desperation. Thoreau wrote, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." He was describing this, the unacknowledged inner war, the compromise between ego and soul that satisfies neither. Or consider the person at the opposite extreme, the one who identifies with shadow, who rejects social adaptation, who becomes the rebel, the outsider, the dark figure. This too is imbalance. This is ego identifying with shadow rather than integrating it. It's still division, just with the roles reversed. True integration requires both, the ego's structure and the shadow's vitality, the persona's adaptation and the soul's authenticity. Apollo and Dionysus not in opposition, but in dance. The ancient Greeks understood this. Their tragedies explored the consequences of hubris, the ego's overreach, and nemesis, the compensatory force that brings balance. Oedipus, attempting to escape his fate, runs directly into it. Creon, imposing rigid order, destroys what he loves. The message is consistent. What you deny returns to destroy you, unless you face it, unless you integrate it, unless you transform war into marriage. And this is where we arrive at the heart of the conflict. The central paradox of human psychology. The koan that Jung spent his life contemplating. To become whole, we must embrace our divisions. To find peace, we must acknowledge the war. To heal, we must descend into the wound. The shadow is not something to be eliminated. It's something to be integrated. The ego is not something to be dissolved. It's something to be expanded. The war between them is not something to be won. It's something to be transformed into collaboration. But how? That's the question we've been building toward. That's the revelation waiting in Act 3. Because the conflict, as intense as it is not the end. The descent into shadow, as dark as it becomes, is not the destination. It's the passage. It's the necessary death that precedes resurrection. It's the dismemberment that allows reassembly. The war between ego and soul is the chrysalis. And what emerges, if we endure the transformation, is something neither ego nor shadow alone could become. Something integrated, something whole, something that Jung called the self. But we're not there yet. First, we must go deeper still. We must understand not just the conflict, but the moment of crisis, the point of no return, the descent's darkest hour. Because there is a moment in every inner war when everything comes to a head, when the defenses finally break, when the ego can no longer maintain its illusions, when the shadow rises with undeniable force. This is the dark night. This is the breakdown that precedes breakthrough. This is the death that makes space for rebirth. And it is to this moment, this crisis, that we now turn. Not to frighten you, but to prepare you. Because if you're listening deeply, if you're allowing these words to penetrate, you're already descending. You're already feeling the edges of your own shadow, the cracks in your own ego. That discomfort? That's not a problem. That's the process beginning. That's the first light in the darkness, paradoxically arriving as darkness itself. Stay with me. The descent continues, but revelation awaits. There is a moment in the descent when everything inverts, when the darkness you've been falling through suddenly reveals itself as the very light you were seeking, when the shadow you've been fleeing turns out to be the guide you needed, when the war between ego and soul transforms into something else entirely, into conversation, into collaboration, into the birth of something new. Jung called this moment enantiodromia at the deepest level, the ultimate reversal. Alchemists called it the nigredo giving way to albedo, blackness transforming into whiteness. Christian mystics called it resurrection, death and rebirth. the crucifixion preceding the rising. But what does this actually mean psychologically? What happens when integration begins? Let's return to our understanding of structure. The ego is the center of consciousness, the I that navigates the world. The shadow contains everything the ego rejected, and the self, capital S, is the totality, the center of both conscious and unconscious, the organizing principle of the whole psyche. In most people, the ego believes it is the self. It thinks it's the center of everything. It operates from the delusion that I am in control, I am deciding, I am running my life. But individuation, the process of becoming whole, requires the ego to undergo a fundamental shift, not to be destroyed, but to be relativized, to recognize that it's not the sun around which everything revolves, but a planet orbiting something greater. This shift is what the mystics called ego death. But it's not literal death. It's death of the ego's supremacy. It's the ego discovering humility, discovering its proper place as servant rather than master, as vehicle rather than driver. When this shift happens, something extraordinary occurs. The ego stops fighting the shadow and starts learning from it. The conscious and unconscious begin to communicate. The divided self remembers its original unity. Practically, what does this integration look like? How do you know it's happening? First sign, the symptoms ease, not because you've suppressed them better, but because the internal pressure lessens. Depression lifts, anxiety diminishes, psychosomatic pain reduces. The body relaxes because the war is de-escalating. Second sign, dreams change. The pursuing shadow figure stops chasing, or you turn and speak with it, or it transforms into something else, a guide, a friend, an ally. The unconscious signals that it's being heard, that the conflict is resolving. Third sign, projection decreases. You become less reactive. The people who triggered you still have their flaws, but you no longer feel compelled to fix them, judge them, change them. You recognize their shadows without needing to fight them because you've made peace with your own. Fourth sign, creativity increases. When psychic energy stops going into internal warfare, it becomes available for creation, for imagination, for what Jung called active imagination, the capacity to work consciously with unconscious content. Fifth sign, paradox becomes comfortable. You can hold contradictions without needing to resolve them. You can be both strong and vulnerable, both rational and emotional, both individual and connected. The either-or thinking of the divided self gives way to the both-and thinking of the integrated self. This is not perfection. This is not the elimination of all conflict. This is something more real and more sustainable, the capacity to hold tension consciously rather than acting it out unconsciously. Let me offer you a different metaphor for understanding this process. Imagine consciousness as a house. The ego lives on the ground floor, in the rooms with windows in daylight. This is waking life, rational thought, social interaction. It's well furnished, familiar, controlled. The shadow lives in the basement, dark, neglected, locked away. It contains everything banished from the respectable floors: rage, grief, desire, fear, the parts of yourself too wild or wounded or weird for polite company. For most people, the door to the basement stays locked, and life proceeds fine, until it doesn't. Until something cracks the door open, crisis, trauma, transition. And suddenly there's this sense of something underneath, something seeping up through the floorboards. The ego's first response: nail the door shut, reinforce it, pretend it's not happening. But integration means opening the door, walking down the stairs, turning on the lights in the basement, and actually looking at what's there. And here's what you discover. Yes, there are monsters, but there are also treasures. Yes, there's your rage, but there's also your power. Yes, there's your grief, but there's also your capacity for depth and empathy. Yes, there's your shame, but beneath it is the authentic self you buried to survive. More than that, you discover that the basement is bigger than the ground floor. The unconscious is vaster than consciousness. The shadow contains not just personal repressed content, but what Jung called the collective unconscious, archetypal patterns shared by all humans across all cultures: the hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, the anima and animus, the symbols and stories that pre-exist individual experience. When you descend into your personal shadow, you eventually hit this deeper layer. You discover that your individual psyche connects to something transpersonal, something collective, something that speaks in the language of myth and archetype. This is why Jung insisted that therapy must eventually become more than personal healing. It must become a spiritual journey, because the shadow, fully explored, opens onto the sacred. Let me ground this with neuroscience for a moment, because integration isn't just mystical, it's biological. Research in interpersonal neurobiology, particularly the work of Daniel Siegel, shows that integration literally changes brain structure. When we bring unconscious content into consciousness, when we create what Siegel calls linkage between different neural networks, the brain becomes more coherent, more flexible, more resilient. The prefrontal cortex, our executive function, our conscious decision-making, develops stronger connections with the limbic system, our emotional brain. The left hemisphere's narratives integrate with the right hemisphere's holistic perception. The top-down regulatory systems connect with bottom-up somatic awareness. This is integration at the neural level, the divided brain becoming whole. And the subjective experience is precisely what depth psychology describes: greater self-awareness, emotional regulation, authentic choice, sense of meaning. We're not talking about abstract theory. We're talking about measurable changes in how the brain functions when the psyche integrates. Moreover, polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, shows that the nervous system has multiple states: sympathetic activation, fight or flight, dorsal vagal shutdown, freeze, and ventral vagal engagement, safe and social. Trauma and internal warfare keep us stuck in threat states. Integration, making peace between ego and shadow, allows the nervous system to return to regulation. You literally feel safer in your own body when you're not at war with yourself. But integration is not a one-time event. It's not a destination you reach and then you're done. It's an ongoing process, a continuous dialogue, a relationship that must be maintained. Jung spent the last decades of his life emphasizing this. Individuation, he said, is the work of a lifetime. It's not something you achieve in therapy and then graduate from. It's a commitment to ongoing consciousness, ongoing dialogue with the unconscious, ongoing integration of whatever arises. This is why spiritual traditions speak of practice, meditation, prayer, ritual, art. These are technologies for maintaining the ego self-axis, for keeping the conversation between conscious and unconscious alive. When the conversation stops, when we stop paying attention to dreams, to symptoms, to synchronicity, the division begins again. The shadow accumulates new content. The ego reasserts its supremacy. The war resumes. But when we maintain practice, when we continue the dialogue, something remarkable happens. Consciousness itself evolves. Let me explain what I mean by this, because it's perhaps the most important insight in all of depth psychology. Jung believed that consciousness is not static. It's evolving. Humanity is becoming more conscious over time, albeit slowly, painfully, imperfectly. Look at history. Ancient humans were more merged with the unconscious. They experienced visions, heard voices, felt possessed by gods and demons. Consciousness was less differentiated. The ego was weaker. Over millennia, the ego strengthened. We developed rationality, science, individualism. We separated from nature, from the unconscious, from the gods. We became, in a sense, more conscious, but also more divided. Now, Jung argued, we're at another inflection point. We can't go back to merged consciousness. We can't unknow our individuality. But we can't continue in division. The internal and external wars are becoming unsustainable. The next evolution is integration, conscious relationship with the unconscious. the ego strong enough to dialogue with the shadow without being overwhelmed, consciousness that includes the unconscious rather than excluding it. This is what he meant by the self, not just the integrated individual, but a new stage of human consciousness, where rationality and intuition work together, where thinking and feeling complement each other, where the conscious and unconscious are in creative partnership. And here's the profound part. Jung believed that when individuals integrate, they contribute to collective evolution, that your personal work on your personal shadow doesn't just heal you, it lightens the collective shadow. It makes the world incrementally more conscious. He wrote, "The world hangs by a thin thread, and that thread is the psyche of man." In other words, individual consciousness determines collective fate. The inner war or the inner peace ripples outward. Let's talk about technology for a moment, because it adds a fascinating dimension to this discussion. We're living in an era of unprecedented technological integration, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, brain-computer interfaces, technologies that externalize and augment human consciousness. Some see this as dangerous, as consciousness being lost to machines. But through a Jungian lens, it's potentially the opposite. It's the unconscious becoming externalized, visible, workable. AI, for instance, learns patterns from vast data, much like how the unconscious holds patterns from vast experience. When we interact with AI, we're in a sense interacting with an externalized form of collective pattern recognition. This could support integration. Imagine AI tools that help you understand your dreams, recognize your projections, identify your shadow content. Imagine technology that makes the unconscious more accessible to consciousness, or it could exacerbate division. Imagine technology that allows even more sophisticated repression, more convincing personas, more elaborate defenses against self-knowledge. The technology itself is neutral. What matters is the consciousness wielding it. Which brings us back to the fundamental question. Will we integrate, or will we remain divided? Will we use our tools for self-knowledge or self-deception, for connection or distraction, for evolution or regression? Jung had a vision late in his life. He saw humanity at a crossroads. One path led to continued projection of the shadow onto others, more wars, more scapegoating, more collective madness. The other path led to collective individuation, more people doing their inner work, integrating their shadows, becoming conscious. He believed the fate of humanity hung on which path we chose, not through politics or technology, but through psychological development, through enough individuals making peace with their shadows that the collective shadow loses its grip. This might sound grandiose, mystical, naive, but consider the alternative. If people remain unconscious of their projections, what happens? They elect leaders who embody their shadow. They join movements that act out their collective rage. They go to war with other nations who represent their disowned qualities. All of history's atrocities come down to this: the refusal to make the shadow conscious, the insistence on dividing the world into good and evil, us and them, light and dark, and then projecting all darkness outward. Integration is not just personal healing, it's potentially civilization saving. When you make peace with your shadow, you stop needing enemies. When you integrate your opposites, you stop dividing the world into opposites. When you become whole, you recognize wholeness in others. This is the promise hidden in the inner war, that the conflict itself, if approached consciously, can transform not just you, but the world you inhabit. Let me bring this to practical application, because these ideas are worthless if they remain abstract. How do you actually integrate? What are the steps? Step 1. Notice. Pay attention to your triggers, your dreams, your reactions, your symptoms. When you feel disproportionate emotion, ask, what in me is being activated? What am I projecting? Step 2. Name. Give language to what you notice. I'm feeling rage. I'm experiencing fear. I'm projecting my father onto my boss. Language brings consciousness. What we can name, we can work with. Step 3. Feel. Allow the emotion to move through you without acting it out or suppressing it. Feel the rage without attacking. Feel the grief without collapsing. Feel the desire without impulsively pursuing. This is containment, holding the tension consciously. Step 4. Inquire. Ask the shadow what it wants. Use active imagination, journaling, art, dialogue. Why are you here? What are you trying to tell me? What part of me do you represent? Listen for the answer, which will come not in logic but in image, feeling, intuition. Step 5. Integrate. Find a way to give the shadow what it truly needs, not what it impulsively demands, but what it's actually seeking. Usually it's not the surface desire, but something deeper. Recognition, permission to exist, inclusion in your sense of self. Step 6. Express. Find appropriate channels for shadow qualities. If your shadow contains rage, find physical outlets, martial arts, drumming, advocacy. If your shadow contains sadness, find expressive outlets, music, poetry, meaningful conversation. If your shadow contains creativity, create. Step 7. Return. Bring the insights from the descent back into daily life. Live differently, make different choices. Allow the integration to change how you move through the world. This is not a linear process. You'll cycle through these steps many times with different shadow content throughout your life. But each cycle brings more integration. Each cycle expands consciousness. Each cycle moves you closer to wholeness. There's a beautiful paradox at the heart of this process. The more you integrate your shadow, the less shadow there is to integrate. But simultaneously, the more shadow you discover. Because as consciousness expands, it illuminates deeper layers. You integrate one level of shadow only to discover another beneath it. You integrate personal shadow only to discover collective shadow. You integrate that only to discover archetypal shadow, the universal patterns of darkness in the human psyche. This is not discouraging. This is the nature of the journey. You don't arrive at a place where you're done being human, where you've transcended all shadow, where you're pure light. That's the ego's fantasy of perfection. That's spiritual bypassing, using spiritual ideas to avoid the messy work of being human. Real integration accepts humanity, messy, contradictory, light and dark, conscious and unconscious. Real integration says, I contain multitudes, I am vast, I am process, not product. And from that acceptance comes something unexpected, peace. Not the peace of having resolved all conflict, but the peace of no longer being at war with your own existence. You become, in Nietzsche's formulation, a person who can say yes to life, to all of it, the darkness and the light, the suffering and the joy. My formula for greatness in a human being is amor fati, he wrote, love of fate, love of what is. This is the fruit of integration, not transcendence of humanity, but full embrace of it. Not escape from the inner war, but transformation of it into creative tension, into the engine of becoming. Jung wrote toward the end of his life, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. That light is consciousness, and consciousness is kindled through the work we've been describing, the descent into shadow, the integration of opposites, the movement toward wholeness. Every person who does this work makes the world slightly more conscious. Every shadow integrated is one less projection in the collective. Every individual who becomes whole contributes to the possibility of collective wholeness. This is not naive optimism. Look at the world. Look at the wars, the hatred, the environmental destruction, the mindless consumption. This is collective shadow run rampant. This is humanity refusing to look in the mirror. But look also at the helpers, the healers, the artists, the activists doing genuine work. Look at the people who have descended into their own darkness and returned with wisdom. Look at the communities built on authentic connection rather than shared projection. This too is real. This too is possible. This is what happens when enough individuals choose integration. The inner war, when transformed, becomes the inner peace that radiates outward. The integrated individual becomes a center of consciousness that affects everyone they touch, not through preaching or proselytizing, but through presence. through being whole in a world of division, through responding rather than reacting, through seeing clearly rather than through the distortions of projection. This is the promise. This is the possibility. This is what awaits on the other side of the descent into shadow. Are you glimpsing it now? Are you feeling the shift from conflict to integration, from war to peace, from division to wholeness? The journey is not complete. It never is. But the awakening has begun, and with awakening comes responsibility. The responsibility to live consciously, to maintain the dialogue with the unconscious, to integrate what arises, to embody the wholeness you've discovered. This is the work. This is the practice. This is the price and the privilege of becoming who you truly are. We have descended together into the depths of the psyche. We have traced the origins of the inner war, how the whole child splits into ego and shadow. We have witnessed the conflict, how the shadow rises and the ego defends. We have explored the path of integration, how war transforms into wholeness. Now we must return, not to where we started, but to life, carrying what we've discovered, embodying what we've learned. The hero's journey, as Campbell mapped it, always includes the return. The hero descends, faces trials, gains the treasure, and must bring it back to the community. Odysseus must return to Ithaca. Inanna must rise from the underworld. Christ must emerge from the tomb. The psychological journey follows the same pattern. You descend into your shadow, confront what you've denied, integrate what you find, and then you must live differently. You must bring the insight into embodiment, the understanding into action, the revelation into relationship. This is where many people falter. They have profound realizations, but don't integrate them into daily life. They see their shadow clearly, but continue the same patterns. They understand the concepts, but don't do the work. Understanding is not transformation. Insight is not integration. Knowing about the shadow is not the same as befriending it. The real work begins when you close this video, when you step back into your life, when you encounter the next trigger, the next projection, the next moment of choice between the old patterns and new possibility. But you're not returning empty-handed. You're returning with a map of the territory, with language for the experience, with tools for the journey. You know now that the discomfort you feel sometimes is not weakness, it's the shadow asking for attention. You know that the people who trigger you are mirrors, not enemies. You know that your symptoms are messages, your dreams are letters, your slips are communications from the parts of you trying to be heard. You know that consciousness is not about perfection, but about awareness. Not about eliminating the shadow, but about integrating it. Not about winning the inner war, but about transforming it into creative dialogue. And perhaps most importantly, you know that you're not alone in this. Every human being is fighting this same inner war. Every person you meet is navigating their own descent, wrestling with their own shadow, seeking their own integration. This recognition can transform how you move through the world. The judgment you once felt toward others softens. The criticism you directed outward turns to compassionate curiosity. You see in everyone the same struggle, the attempt to be whole in a world that demands division. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. When you integrate your shadow, you become a different chemical substance. Your interactions change, your relationships deepen, your presence affects others differently, not because you're trying to be transformative, but because you are transformed. Wholeness is contagious. Consciousness spreads. When you stop projecting, you invite others to own their projections. When you speak authentically, you give others permission to drop their masks. When you integrate your opposites, you demonstrate that integration is possible. This is the return. This is the gift you bring back from the descent. Not just your own healing, but the possibility of collective healing. Not just your own consciousness, but contribution to the evolution of consciousness itself. Let me leave you with a question, not to answer immediately, but to live with. a question that will work on you the way this entire journey has been working on you. What would your life look like if you stopped being at war with yourself? What would you create? How would you love? What risks would you take? What truth would you speak? Who would you become? Not the perfect version, not the ego's fantasy, but the whole version, the integrated version, the you that includes all the parts you've been hiding, all the qualities you've been denying, all the potential you've been suppressing. That version is not somewhere in the future. It's not something you have to earn or achieve. It's here now, waiting beneath the armor, beneath the persona, beneath the patterns of division. The inner war ends not when one side wins, but when both sides remember they were never separate. When the ego and soul recognize they are two aspects of one being. When consciousness and unconscious acknowledge they are partners in the project of becoming. The ancient mystery schools had a teaching, as above, so below, as within, so without. The outer world reflects the inner world. The collective mirrors the individual. The wars between nations are projections of the wars within individuals. The peace we seek externally must first be achieved internally. You cannot control the external world. You cannot force others to become conscious. You cannot solve humanity's problems through politics or technology alone, but you can end your inner war. You can integrate your shadow. You can become whole. And in doing so, you change the equation. You add one more node of consciousness to the network. You lighten the collective shadow by that much. You demonstrate through your life that integration is possible. This is not small. This is not selfish. This is perhaps the most important work any human can do, to become fully conscious, fully authentic, fully human. Thank you for descending with me into these depths. Thank you for your willingness to look at what many refuse to see. Thank you for your courage in facing your own shadow, even if only for the duration of this journey. The war between ego and soul continues, in you, in me, in humanity. But it doesn't have to be war. It can be conversation. It can be dance. It can be the creative tension that generates new consciousness, new possibility, new life. May you befriend your shadow. May you integrate your opposites. May you become who you always were beneath the division. And may the descent into darkness lead you, as it has led countless others, to the light that was always there, the light of consciousness, the light of wholeness, the light of your own being, fully realized. The journey continues. The descent is never finished, but the awakening has begun, and that changes everything.